Hello everyone, I hope you're well. Today I thought we'd go into the specifics of the highlights and shadows sliders in Lightroom. There'll be lots of you who are familiar with those tools and have shown them in use in a lot of my previous videos, but I thought this time I'd really go into the detail of exactly how they work. That kind of understanding is really useful to me. I suspect it will be new to you. I certainly don't think there's anything like it on YouTube at the moment. So we're really going to dig into the detail of what's happening when you move those sliders around. And hopefully if you have that understanding, you'll see how those tools can be effectively applied. So let's get started. So this is the photo we're going to work with, a pretty incredible burst of late light on Senja in Norway. This was actually on a workshop, and it was sod's law that the very best light we had was when we were having a relaxing day down by the coast as opposed to camping on the mountain summits. But that's the way it works out sometimes, and you certainly can't complain about conditions like these. And I think these drops of rain landing in the tidal pool were particularly lucky. So this is the image we're using because of course it has enormous amounts of contrast, so lots of shadows and lots of highlights, so it's good to illustrate the point. And we're working with a DNG file here, so this is actually the combination of 3 bracketed shots just to make sure we have all that tonal range. So we want to go from this unedited image, albeit I've added half a stop of exposure adjustment there, to this image, which is a flattened version, so it doesn't have the contrast. I'd probably add some contrast here and actually do less with these highlights and shadows sliders. But this is the finishing point we're trying to get to for argument's sake, where effectively we've darkened down the highlights, particularly in this super bright area here, and lifted up the shadows and the shadows in the mountain in particular. But we haven't made it look unnatural. So it looks a bit flat maybe, and we could just add a bit of contrast, but this is a good point to be editing from because there's no artifacts and it just looks natural immediately. So what is Lightroom doing here? How is it achieving this? Because I know that when I try and do this manually, it's almost impossible. And I'm going to explain why that is and why these sliders are so clever. Of course, you could just accept that they are very clever and use them and not worry about this video. But if you're a geek like me, then you might appreciate this bit of background interest, if you like. So here is an adjustment I've made using the curves tool in Lightroom to darken the highlights. Now, this adjustment actually isn't perfect because it's already working with a clipped version of the histogram, and the highlights and shadow sliders have access to information in a slightly different way. So where this actual final point would lie is kind of up for debate because however you drag down the whites here, this area doesn't bring out the detail that the highlights slider will do, and that's not really something that I can work around using the curves adjustment here. But actually I'm not so bothered about this area. Let's say we could sort that out. What I'm bothered about is this grayness, this gray edge coming into the cloud just here, this weird color shift. So I'll go between the unedited and then the edited, and you can see that trying to darken down these highlights has actually made the image worse. So yes, we have recovered a bit of detail, but it's made it look worse around this transition edge. Whereas if we look at what the highlights slider does, it does an amazing job. This looks really, really good. A little bit dark maybe, but the actual transitions are beautifully handled. There's lots of detail in the cloud, beautiful colors. It really is perfect. So onto a slightly different example, the opposite version. So this time lifting the shadows. So we're trying to replicate what the shadow slider does by boosting the brightness of the shadow areas. And you actually see that the whole sky this time seems to lose its detail and turn grey. All that colour's gone. The actual shadow areas look fairly good, but this area, as it gets towards mid-tones and highlights, it starts to look really flat and weird. So this is not a good example. Again, the original is far preferable to trying to make that correction with curves. So then we have a look at what Lightroom does, and you can see Lightroom does this amazing job. It lifts all of the shadows everywhere in this really natural, beautiful way. And we have all the color attention. So there's the original, and there is the Lightroom shadows adjustment. Again, it's done an absolutely perfect job. And then we can try and do both at the same time with curves. So you can see here I've lifted the shadows and darkened the highlights, and this looks truly horrendous because we've got the worst of every world here. The sky is completely washed out. Almost all of the detail has gone. And that's actually because what we've tried to do is darken the highlights and boost the shadows, but in the middle we've done nothing, and so the shadows have moved closer to the midtones and the highlights have moved closer to the midtones, and so they kind of end up all the same kind of tone, and all the contrast is gone and all the color is gone too. So that's why this kind of reverse S-curve doesn't do a good job at all. In fact, it just looks terrible compared to the original file there. So that's really not great at all. But what about the shadows and highlight sliders? Well, they have done an amazing job. Again, it's flawless. So what exactly is going on here? What are the shadows and highlight sliders doing that is so clever? Well, to figure that out, we're going to go into Photoshop. Hopefully you can follow along without any understanding of Photoshop, because I'm not going to be going into any Photoshop tools at all. Whether you can actually understand what I'm going on about, I have no idea. I don't know how good I am at explaining this sort of thing, but hopefully you can follow along, and I will certainly try to make it as clear as possible. But just before I get into that, I am going to do a little bit of Photoshop stuff just for you guys who want to recreate this kind of thing yourself. So I'm going to explain my process for creating these black and white masks that you're going to see in a second. So here I've got the original version of the photo, no adjustments at all. And then I've got a copy where the only adjustment made here is -100 in the highlight slider in Lightroom. And I want to know what the difference is between these two images, what areas have changed and by how much. So in trying to figure that out, what I first do is I create desaturated versions of those layers. That just removes the complication of color and makes it clearer what's going on. No other reason for doing that. So here's that unedited layer but desaturated, and here is the -100 highlight slider desaturated. So these are the two desaturated layers, and we want to see the difference between them. So I set the blend mode of that -100 highlights layer to difference. And then just to exaggerate what you see here, I've got a quick adjustment that just brightens things up, creates more contrast effectively so that we can actually see what's going on. And basically what you have here is a map of the areas of the image that have changed the most. So where you see white, that's where it's changed the most. Where you see black, it hasn't changed at all. Where you see anything close to black, dark grey, it's barely changed at all. Where you see a light grey, it's changed quite a lot, but not as much as white, and so on and so forth. So we're going to go through this one by one, starting with the highlights. So let's think about exactly what we want to happen here. We've got this massive bright area. Obviously we want that to be darker, but we don't want, say, the darkest cloud up here to be darker. That's dark enough. So at some point we're going to be darkening masses here and then less as we get into this darker area. So you'd think that what we want to do is sort of follow the brightness of the cloud with the amount of change that we're applying. So this here is kind of a map of that. So you can see we're sort of following the edge of the cloud, and we're going to darken these white areas the most, and then slightly less as it gets darker, and less, and so on and so forth. That seems to make really good sense. But actually that isn't what the highlight slider in Lightroom does. The highlight slider in Lightroom darkens like this. So you can see that it really doesn't follow the edge of that cloud very well at all. If anything, it's sort of approximated. And there's a bit of following the texture of the cloud. It's sort of half following it. But partly it's also just doing this general area of darkening, and there's relatively little detail actually captured as part of that edge compared to the example that I just showed you there. And the real difference here can be seen when you see the results, because that is actually the change mask, if you like, for our curves adjustment that produced this horrendous result versus our highlights adjustment, which produced this amazing result. So specifically why the highlight slider is doing a really good job here is that the mask, or the area that is being changed the most, does not follow the clouds exactly. And in fact, if you look very carefully, you can see that this local area of cloud is actually a bit darker than the bit above it. And that's because that soft mask that's sort of approximated the area has actually ended up very slightly over darkening this area as opposed to the area above. But the overall effect is great because what we aren't doing is locally reducing the edge contrast. We're not reducing micro contrast or macro contrast. And it's that makes all these details in the clouds look great. Whereas if we go back to that curves example, so this mask here, what we've actually done is we've taken the bright area beneath the slightly darker cloud and we've brightened it up to meet it. So suddenly tonally everything starts to mesh together because we're making those brighter tones as dark as the mid-tone. So they just all come together and you lose all that detail. So it's this approximate mask that the highlights adjustment uses that does such a brilliant job in this case. So what about the shadows? Here is that plus 100 shadows adjustment, and what a brilliant job Lightroom has done again. So we can just turn that off and then back on again, and you can see that we can now see into this mountain ridge. You can see much better structure in the cloud. So what exactly has Lightroom done? What would we want it to do? Well, let's have a quick think about this. What we want to happen is the darkest tones to be brightened more than the slightly lighter tones. So as we get closer to the mid-tones, we want it to brighten those tones less. That's kind of what we want to achieve. And actually what we want to do is make sure that the blacks don't get brightened, because we don't want our blacks to turn grey. So maybe the very, very darkest tones, we want to keep them roughly where they are. But everything else that's dark, we want to brighten that the most, and so on. So let's have a map of what that looks like we did with the highlights, and this is basically what we'd be aiming for. So we're looking to really brighten up those dark areas in the clouds, but as they start to shift into lighter tones, we want that change to happen less. And where we've got the black tones in the mountain, well, we don't want those to be brightened too much because then we lose our blacks. But everything that's getting close to black, we want that to be lightened quite a lot. And you can see the ridge here. We really want that to be brightened. But unfortunately, when we do that, this is basically the result we get. So everything gets flattened again, just like we saw with the highlights. So you're basically taking your darker tones and you're pushing them towards the mid-tones. So there's very little difference between the mid-tones and the dark tones anymore, and you end up with this grey mess. So that isn't what we want to do. So what exactly does that shadow slider do in Lightroom? Well, here is a map of the adjustment it actually makes, and you can see that it doesn't follow the shape of the true cloud at all, really. It's almost exclusively this soft edged adjustment. Very little detail that's actually there in the cloud is matched by that adjustment. So it's kind of saying, let's brighten this top right hand corner really quite a lot, and then just gradually less as we get towards this brighter area where the sun's starting to peek through. And then you can see in the shadow areas, a bit like our adjustment, actually, it's decided, no, we don't want to brighten the blacks, but we do want to brighten the ridge, just not quite as much as in our estimate of what we might want to happen. And so it kind of does this very clever combination of a soft edged mask and a really detailed one, so really matching the tones that happen in the image, and you get this sort of bizarre looking result. But the actual result of the adjustment is absolutely perfect, and it's perfect for the same reason that the highlights adjustment works so well. It's because, broadly speaking, it is following what we suggested would be the right thing to do, that is brightening the darkest tones the most, for example in this top corner of the sky. But rather than following that rule to the letter, it said, well, we want to maintain the local contrast, the micro contrast, the macro contrast in these kinds of areas, because I want to be able to see all the details in the cloud. So what we're going to do is brighten the darkest tones, but anything that's in proximity to those darker tones, we're going to brighten those as well, even if they are a bit brighter than the darkest tones. So it's really difficult for me to explain this and talk about it, but it's basically trying to maintain the edge contrast, so keeping all of these details in the sky whilst you make that brightening adjustment. Because as we established, if you don't do that, if you purely brighten things based on their tone, then all you do is bring those tones together and you lose contrast and you lose color. And that's why our curves adjustments, the sort of brute force approach, did such a poor job, because they don't take that kind of local contrast into consideration. And that's what can make these textures so beautiful. So that's kind of where you can finish this video, but I will just go one step further, because I have done the final step here and said, well, what happens when we do shadows and highlights at the same time? So this is the image with both corrections applied, and let's just turn the visibility off those so that we can hopefully see the original. So let's turn that off and that off as well. So here's the original, and then we're going to have a look at our corrected file. So this time we've boosted the shadows and darkened the highlights together. And which areas have changed the most? Well, unsurprisingly, we have a combination of both of those two masks that I've just discussed, and you end up with this really bizarre looking area of change. So we're basically saying that in the center here, we darkened those highlights very considerably, and in the top right we brightened the shadows quite considerably, and where this black line is, we've actually made no change at all. And you can see that this doesn't really follow the cloud pattern at all, but it is an actually quite gradual shift between these various tones, and so you won't actually be able to see that line at all, because basically either side of it you're hardly making any change at all, and it's all hidden in the strength of the adjustments in the other areas. And here's the same attempt but using the curves adjustment. So here is a map of that curve. So again, we're following the detail in the cloud, and that's what makes it look so terrible, because what we've done is we've taken the shadows and pushed them towards the midtones, and we've taken the highlights and we've pushed them towards the midtones, and we've just ended up with a complete mess. So if we compare that to the highlights and shadows sliders, then it really is an absolute night and day difference, and you certainly can't make out where that line was. So you can look and see where that line is there, and then it's completely gone. And that's the intelligent work of those sliders. They really were very well designed, in my opinion, by the Adobe engineers. They're not absolutely perfect. They can introduce very minor artifacts if you overuse them. So on this ridge, I can make out ever such slight halos, which would bother me slightly, so I would dial back on those sliders. But quite honestly, they produce a much better result than you can achieve without going into the very most advanced processing techniques we have available. So just amazing tools there, and I hope you've followed along with this sort of 20 minutes of geekery. Okay, I appreciate this isn't for everyone, but I love to understand exactly what's going on here. And one really good reason for that is that I can use these tools with absolute confidence, knowing what's going on behind the scenes. So hopefully you found this interesting. If you would like me to pick apart more Lightroom tools and explain to you exactly what's going on, if you found that interesting, I really would appreciate your comments, because it's so hard for me to judge without your feedback what's going down well and what's not. But if you have any other suggestions for videos, it doesn't have to be picking apart Lightroom adjustments, then please do let me know. And of course, do all that following and liking and commenting and receiving notifications, which I'm still getting to grips with. But any help to grow this channel is, of course, much appreciated.